Hello and welcome back to Highway Farty. My name is Don. It is good to have you back. Just want to start out today with a little housekeeping before I get to the story that I have planned for you today. That's because I have finally finished the Instagram page that I have been working on, and now I just have to figure out how to populate it with content. Easier said than done, because these stories that I do are too long for Instagram. And so I found an AI program that will take my long-form history stories and cut them down into a form that will fit on Instagram. And supposedly this program goes through and picks out the good content and makes it acceptable to Instagram. We will see how that works. And at the very least, it will serve as a tease to the longer form stories that I do, which will always be on my YouTube channel, Highway Farty, and also on my website, highwayfarty.com. So that takes care of the housekeeping for that aspect of it. Now, I do want to mention, though, what the purpose of these videos is. I enjoy going around the St. Louis area looking for places where history happened. As I say in my introduction, these are the places we drive by every day without even realizing that history happened here. Now, today I am in Perryville, Missouri. So I'm not just limited to St. Louis. I go elsewhere. In and around the St. Louis area is what I always say about when people ask me where I go with these stories. Now, as for the name Highway Farty, I mentioned it in the introduction, but it bears repeating, because I assumed that everyone would know what I was talking about. That was a big assumption. I remember when St. Louisans called Highway 40 Highway Farty. And it became a bit of a joke. And I don't want this channel to be seen as a joke. I want it to be seen as a celebration of history and that historic way of speaking that is dying out in the St. Louis area. You don't hear people say Highway Farty anymore. It's a peculiar way of pronouncing words with OR next to them. It's not just farty, it's other words like New York and horse and knife and fork, that sort of thing. You don't hear it as much anymore. You also don't hear Highway Farty. So that's why this channel is called Highway Farty. Has nothing to do with farting. Today, as I said, I am in Perryville, Missouri, and this is an absolutely beautiful location. Not a particularly beautiful day, but a beautiful location nonetheless. This is a grotto that was built in 1918. A grotto dedicated to the Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal. The reason I am here today is very time sensitive, because I am going to be posting this video on November 22nd, 2025, exactly 62 years after President Kennedy was assassinated. I am a history nerd. I am into all things history. Sports, movies, politics, crime. Just when I thought I had read everything on the President Kennedy assassination, I came upon a story as I was doing my research for another story on this channel. I came upon something that blew my mind. Read any book on the Kennedy assassination, or read any book by a journalist that covered that day, and the name Oscar Huber will appear. He is usually identified as the Dallas priest who came to Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas and gave the last rites to the President of the United States at the request of Mrs. Kennedy. His name was Oscar Huber, and as I said, he was identified as a Dallas priest. Well, guess what? Yes, he was a Dallas priest then, but he was a St. Louis priest from the beginning and all the way up until the end. And we're going to explore the link between this priest, the Kennedy assassination, and St. Louis. This book that I found, titled "He's Dead All Right." But this book is a book that probably most historians of the Kennedy assassination do not have. It's very hard to find. I got the last copy on Amazon. Oscar Huber spent the last 12 years of his life in turmoil because of what happened that day, and I'm going to talk about that as we visit some locations here in Perryville, which is about 75 miles or so south of St. Louis. We visit some locations here in Perryville that are associated with him. So what I'd like to do is put us in the shoes of Oscar Huber, 62 years ago exactly today. You are a pastor at a church in Dallas. You're not an archbishop, you're not a cardinal, you're not anything having to do with church leadership. You are a simple church pastor at Holy Trinity Church in Dallas, which just happens to be the church nearest Parkland Memorial Hospital. You know when you get up that day that President Kennedy will be passing very near the church in his motorcade. And he's going to pass by just blocks away from where the church is. So around lunchtime, Oscar Huber, Father Huber, walks to the parade route or the motorcade route and is standing there on the sidewalk waiting for President Kennedy to pass. In his writings, Father Huber says that it was a wonderful day because he believes that President Kennedy noticed Huber's Roman collar. And of course, Kennedy, being a Catholic, singled him out and pointed at him and waved at him. It meant a lot to Father Huber that the president noticed him. You have no idea what is going to happen in the next hour. You go back to the rectory to have lunch. Your assistant pastor is there as well. He's Father Thompson. And you're just having lunch. And then a report comes over the television that President Kennedy has been shot.
Here's a bulletin from CBS News. President Kennedy has been the victim of an assassin's bullets in Dallas, Texas. It is not known as yet whether the president survived the attack against him. 3 bullet shots were heard to ring out. The president slumped into the lap of Mrs. Kennedy. Witnesses said they saw blood streaming from his head. Governor Connally slumped into the bottom of the car. Bullet wounds were seen to be in his chest. The car itself rushed on as Mrs. Kennedy was heard to say, "Oh no." It took him directly to a nearby hospital, the Parkland Hospital, where the president and Governor Connally were taken into the emergency room, and witnesses there refused to comment on whether the president was still alive or not.
Instinctively, both Father Huber and Father Thompson make their way to Parkland Memorial Hospital because that hospital is in their parish, and they had been there many, many times ministering to the patients in the hospital. So they were known at Parkland Memorial Hospital, and they just instinctively headed towards the hospital. It takes them about 15 minutes to get there in the traffic. So as you can imagine, the entire press corps has descended on the hospital, and just getting to the hospital was a task. As they're heading to the hospital, an administrator at Parkland Memorial Hospital calls the church and says that Mrs. Kennedy would like a priest. The church secretary assures them that 2 priests are on the way. And, of course, the press camped out outside sees this priest going into the hospital. So once again, you're Oscar Huber. 30 minutes ago, you're standing on the sidewalk watching the president pass by in front of you, and now you're going to the hospital to give last rites to him. That has to be a mind-blowing experience. He goes into the hospital and into the room where President Kennedy is being treated, and he notices that President Kennedy has a sheet over his head already. Now, part of the sacrament of the last rites of the Catholic Church involves anointing the forehead and saying a prayer over the person. So Father Huber peels the sheet back and notices just how badly damaged the president's head is. And there was no way anybody could have survived that. And so Oscar Huber, Father Huber, gives him the last rites. It's very important to Catholics, without getting too deep into church theology and church teachings, but it's very important to Catholics that the last rites be administered while the person is either still alive or while their soul is still in their body. Mrs. Kennedy knew her husband was dead, and had been for quite some time. Minutes anyway, 10, 15 minutes prior to the priest arriving at the hospital. So she knew. She knew he was already gone, but it disturbed her greatly. She wanted to know, basically, did we get him in time? And Father Huber, in an extreme act of compassion and finding the right words at the right time, says to Mrs. Kennedy, "Yes, Mrs. Kennedy, I know his soul was still in his body when I gave him the sacrament." And it put Mrs. Kennedy at ease. Now, in a matter of moments, he is going to find himself part of this whole big, broad conspiracy theory that surrounds the assassination of President Kennedy. He is going to find himself square in the middle of all that. He just doesn't know it yet. As he leaves the hospital, a Secret Service agent approaches him and says to him, "You know nothing." Meaning, it's like the old Sergeant Schultz line from Hogan's Heroes. "I know nothing, you know nothing." The message was quite clear. Keep your trap shut about what happened in there until we can make an official announcement. Because the announcement of President Kennedy's death had not taken place yet. The president died at 1 o'clock. The official announcement doesn't happen until 1:33, when Presidential Press Secretary Mac Kilduff goes in front of the cameras and reads a prepared statement. By the time they make that announcement, though, all the broadcast media operations and all the wire services are moving the story that President Kennedy was dead. Their source they were attributing it to was not official sources at the White House, but Oscar Huber.
Dallas police took up post in the
From the Associated Press, Dateline Dallas, 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds. There is no further confirmation, but this is what we have on a flash basis from the Associated Press.
I want to put us into the shoes of Oscar Huber, because I keep going back to that. How do you handle that? Imagine cameras in your face, people shouting questions, demanding answers. Now, yes, the Secret Service told him to keep his trap shut, but how do you handle that? And therein lies decades and decades of differing stories. For the rest of his life, Father Huber would insist that he did not betray the confidences of the Secret Service. He claims he did not ever announce that the president was dead. How could he remember what he said in that heated moment? Because to a man, the reporters that were there that day said, yes, Oscar Huber is the one who gave us that news, that President Kennedy had in fact died. Walter Cronkite.
Further information here. The Catholic priest who helped perform the last rites, Father Huber, Dallas, said that he did not believe the president was dead at that time. The priest left the emergency operating room at Parkland Hospital and walked out of the hospital. There has been, just a moment, that information, the priest who were with Kennedy, the 2 priests who were with Kennedy say that he is dead of his bullet wounds. That seems to be about as close to official as we can get.
Dan Rather.
Fortunately, 2 priests came very quickly, and I talked to one of the priests, and the priest said he was dead. And I knew then that what we had, unfortunately, was a dead president.
Went on the air with that at CBS, and it was 17 minutes before it was confirmed officially. Did your...
Longest 17 minutes of my life.
But it is Hugh Sidey, the White House bureau chief, White House correspondent for Time magazine, that really hammers the nail into this public relations nightmare coffin that Oscar Huber will spend the rest of his life in because of those few minutes that day. Hugh Sidey says he asked Oscar Huber on the parking lot. He asks Huber, "Is the president dead?" Huber responds, "He's dead, all right." Pretty glib, huh? So you can see why everybody turns on Oscar Huber. And so here, buried in a very discreet, quiet location in Perryville, Missouri, in an undecorated grave. There are other graves out here in the cemetery that have decorations on them, but not his. Here lies the man who was front and center in one of the most historic, tragic days in American history. Terribly misunderstood. And so, rest in peace, Father Huber. Now, before we leave Perryville and head back to St. Louis, I want to take you to a few locations that are here on these grounds that are associated with Father Huber and his career. He was from Perryville, born here, worked on the family farm, was ordained a priest rather late in life, and he takes his seminary training here on these grounds, what was then called St. Mary's of the Baron Seminary. It ceased being a seminary in 1985. And where we're going to go next is where he becomes the pastor of the church here in Perryville. So this is where Father Huber got his start in Perryville, Missouri, back in the 1930s. At that time, this was called Church of the Assumption. Now today it is part of the National Shrine of Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal. Let's just go in and take a quick look around. Okay, so now we're going to head back to St. Louis. Hope you enjoyed that little tour inside this beautiful building. I'll try to get back here to Perryville. Do a little bit more here. But we need to get back to St. Louis because a huge part of Oscar Huber's career towards the end takes place in St. Louis, and that is where we are going to head next. All right, back in St. Louis, here at St. Catherine Labouré Catholic Church on Sappington, just near the intersection of Lindbergh. This is where Father Oscar Huber was transferred to immediately after Dallas. This is where he comes back to and serves as the pastor here from 1968 until 1975, the year that he dies. So for 7 years, the pastor at this church here in South County was the priest who gave the last rites to President Kennedy. While he's here, he becomes a minor worldwide celebrity. Because remember, as the 70s unfold, all the conspiracy theorists come out of the woodwork. The Kennedy assassination becomes a hobby of sorts for lots and lots of people. And Father Huber, pastor here at St. Catherine Labouré, starts getting loads and loads of mail from not just conspiracy theorists, but collectors wanting his autograph. He's a celebrity, and he embraces it. When he dies, they find among his papers a stack of pre-signed photographs. So why does anybody care? Really, President Kennedy was killed. Who cares whether it was announced at one time or another by a priest or a press secretary? What difference does it really make? Well, the conspiracy theorists point to this delay in announcing the president's death as one more example of how the government, or they didn't use this term back then, but the deep state, how they sanitized things. It gave them the time that they needed to put the loose ends together and sanitize the crime scene. That's what the conspiracy theorists think. In reality, what was the reason for the delay in announcing President Kennedy's death? And why was the Secret Service so angry at Father Huber? Well, it had to do with Lyndon Johnson. When President Kennedy was shot, they took him to Parkland Hospital. Also at Parkland Hospital that day was Lyndon Johnson, the vice president. Now, Vice President Johnson had not been wounded, had not been hurt. They kept him in an operating room adjacent to Kennedy. So you had both the president and the vice president under the same roof in an environment that had not been pre-secured. And that made the Secret Service extremely nervous. And then, once President Kennedy was dead, they knew they had the President of the United States, effectively, Lyndon Johnson, unsecured for the most part at Parkland Hospital. And their challenge was how to get him from Parkland out to Air Force One without the whole world knowing. Because after all, if someone wanted to overthrow the United States government, they'd already gotten Kennedy. Now they could get Johnson if they knew that he was at Parkland Memorial Hospital. So it was the utmost secrecy that drove them to delay that announcement, to give them time to get Johnson from Parkland out to Air Force One. That's it. I am convinced we will never know with any degree of certainty what really happened that day in Dallas in 1963. I just don't think we'll ever know. But I do know this. I can say for certain, Father Huber spends the last 7 years of his life here at St. Catherine Labouré in St. Louis trying to polish his public image. Because after all, he goes down in history as somewhat of a blabbermouth. To his dying day, he insists that he did not say those things. He did not release the news of the president's death when he wasn't supposed to. Despite the fact there's a mountain of evidence that says otherwise. And so that ends the story of Father Oscar Huber. Thank you for joining me on Highway Farty. I really don't know where the highway is going to take us next. I'm going to get back to work, do some more research, and I promise this though, I will find us something good, someplace good to go to. Let's just see where the road of history takes us. Bye-bye.